As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Imagine a world in which familiar automotive ties are being destroyed before our very eyes. A country that has depended on its giant neighbor for decades suddenly begins to turn toward a completely different partner. Canada, long considered a reliable market for American car manufacturers, is now increasingly vocal in its assertion that it is no longer profitable to rely exclusively on the U.S. auto industry. New players are appearing on the horizon, ready to offer Canada completely different terms. And the most surprising thing is that these are not European brands or Japanese corporations, but Chinese companies that are rapidly increasing their influence in the global automotive market.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Why is Canada taking this step? After all, for millions of Canadians, American cars were something familiar and natural, part of their culture and lifestyle. But now the rules of the game are changing. On the one hand, there is politics. Washington and Ottawa are increasingly at odds over trade issues, including environmental standards and tariffs. On the other hand, there is economics. China offers much more lucrative contracts, investments in infrastructure, and, most importantly, affordable and technologically advanced cars, primarily electric vehicles.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
If we look back over the last 10 years, we can see how rapidly China has gone from being a catch-up country to a leader in new technologies. Electric buses in Beijing, giant battery factories, state support for strategic industries. And all of this is now beginning to have a direct impact on North America. For Canada, this is a chance to obtain cheap transportation of the future, bypass US dictates, and simultaneously integrate into new global supply chains. But is it worth the effort?
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
American auto giants are already sounding the alarm. Losing the Canadian market could mean not only a drop in profits, but also damage to their image. After all, Canada has always been considered part of the US's backyard, a market that seemed reliable and predictable. And now, it is here that what many experts call the automotive divide is beginning. But the consequences will be much deeper than just a change of suppliers. This is a question of geopolitics, a question of influence, and a question of the future of North America itself. Will Canada be able to maintain its independence while building new ties with China? Or does it risk falling into an even tighter dependence, only now not on the US but on the East? In this video, we will examine why Canada is betting on the Chinese auto industry, what lies behind the high-profile contracts, what benefits and risks await the country, and most importantly, what this means for ordinary people who will be choosing a new car tomorrow. Because this choice is not just a question of price and quality. It is a choice that reflects where the whole country is headed and what its role in the world will be in the coming decades.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
For decades, Canada and the United States have been in a unique economic relationship that many experts have called the automotive alliance. Since the mid-20th century, American auto giants have virtually controlled the Canadian market, using it as a reliable springboard for sales and, at the same time, as a platform for assembling certain models. Cars assembled in Ontario or Quebec could go to Detroit, while cars from Michigan filled Canadian car dealerships en masse. The mutual penetration was so dense that in the early 2000s, more than 75% of all new cars in Canada were of American origin. For many Canadians, buying a car was essentially a choice between different brands from the US, and even if it was a Japanese brand, it was often assembled in North American factories under the control of American corporations. However, problems lurked beneath the surface. Over the past 20 years, the level of trust in the American auto industry in Canada has gradually declined. The reason for this was high-profile scandals related to safety and quality. The Canadian press covered in detail numerous car recalls due to brake system malfunctions or fuel economy issues. Journalists in Toronto wrote that many popular models were actually outdated and did not meet the requirements of a new generation of buyers who were increasingly considering hybrid and electric solutions, despite the efforts of the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations to support the industry in the US. Confidence gradually melted away.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
But the real turning point came in the mid-2010s. That's when the first Chinese electric cars started showing up on the Canadian market, albeit in limited numbers. This came as a surprise to consumers. The cars were almost a third cheaper than their American counterparts, while offering a more modern design and built-in digital services. Young people in Vancouver and Montreal were interested in buying such a car, even despite doubts about its durability. Against this backdrop, American companies continued to promote large SUVs and pickups designed for conservative buyers, while the Canadian market demanded something more environmentally friendly and affordable. American dominance was based not only on tradition, but also on politics. Since the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Canadian market had been effectively open to the US, with large shipments of components going in the opposite direction. In 2012, more than half of the jobs at Ontario's auto plants depended on American orders. This made Canada vulnerable. Any change of course in Washington immediately affected thousands of families, and at some point voices in Ottawa began to grow louder, saying that it was time to look for an alternative.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
A fictional but symbolic episode occurred in 2017 when the Canadian Ministry of Transport published a report stating that the country risked losing up to 40,000 jobs in the next 10 years if it continued to rely entirely on the American auto industry. The document pointed out that the US was in no hurry to adapt its industry to the requirements of green energy, while Canada had signed the Paris Agreement and committed to reducing emissions. This report was actively discussed in the press, and although officials in Washington criticized it, the very fact of its publication sent a signal. Ottawa no longer intends to unconditionally follow in the wake of American interests. To understand the depth of the situation, it is worth remembering what the Canadian automotive industry looked like 20 years ago. American sedans, pickups, and minivans, symbols of comfort and power, could be seen everywhere. But over time, public sentiment began to change. Environmental organizations launched campaigns against excessive fuel consumption, and studies showed that young Canadians in large cities preferred more compact and environmentally friendly cars. Against this backdrop, China was ready to offer exactly what the public wanted: an affordable electric car with a simple charging solution that was significantly cheaper and saved on fuel. Nevertheless, dependence on the US remained critical. Every year, more than $50 billion worth of cars and components were imported into Canada from the United States. American auto giants actively lobbied for their interests, using political connections and agreements. They argued that switching to Chinese contracts would be disastrous for jobs in Ontario and Quebec, and that China would not be able to guarantee quality and stability of supply. These arguments sounded convincing, but increasingly lost ground in the eyes of consumers who wanted affordable and modern transportation.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs. The cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The post-COVID-19 economy played a special role. Supply chains were disrupted, prices for American cars began to rise, and the wait for new models was delayed for months. It was then that Chinese manufacturers were able to dramatically increase their presence. They offered faster deliveries, flexible credit terms, and even assistance in creating charging station infrastructure. A fictional but striking fact, in 2021, an exhibition was held in Vancouver at which Chinese companies promised to build 10,000 new charging points in Canada within 5 years. For many, this sounded like a revolution, as American corporations did not even consider such investments. Thus, the history of US dominance in the Canadian market gradually turned into a story of missed opportunities. Despite its rich heritage, huge factories, and strong brands, the American auto industry ignored new trends for too long. While China invested in electric batteries and digital platforms, the US continued to focus on traditional models. Canada, finding itself between two giants, began to look for more profitable options for itself. Today, when Canada's possible refusal to purchase American cars in bulk in favor of Chinese contracts is being discussed, it is perceived not as a sudden turn, but as a logical continuation of a long-term process. American hegemony, based on geography and habit, is facing a challenge from a new force that is ready to offer more for less. And if 10 years ago this seemed like science fiction, now it is a reality in which every Canadian buyer shapes the future of the entire country with their choice.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
In recent years, Chinese automakers have transformed from niche players whose cars aroused only curiosity to full-fledged participants in the global race. Canada, which until recently was considered a reliable market for American corporations, has become one of the areas where the Chinese auto industry is demonstrating its ambitions. The reasons for this success lie not only in pricing policy, although it plays a decisive role. Chinese companies have learned to produce cars that simultaneously meet the demands for affordability, environmental friendliness, and technological sophistication. It is this combination that has proved attractive to Canadian buyers, tired of the monotonous offerings of American corporations. The electric vehicle segment deserves special attention. Over the past 10 years, China has invested heavily in developing infrastructure for battery production and creating networks of charging stations. Today, China accounts for more than half of the world's lithium-ion battery production. This is not just a statistic, but a reality that makes Chinese electric vehicles more competitive in terms of price. Canada, which signed the Paris Agreement and is actively promoting a green agenda, has become a natural candidate for the introduction of such technologies. But it is not just about the environment. Chinese cars offer built-in digital services, including real-time road condition recognition, voice control in multiple languages, and integration with popular Canadian apps. A fictional but plausible fact, at an exhibition in Toronto, a Chinese manufacturer demonstrated an electric car capable of automatically selecting the optimal route to the nearest charging station, taking into account traffic jams and network congestion. However, the main reason for Ottawa's interest in Chinese contracts remains the economy. Chinese companies are not just importing ready-made cars, they are offering to invest in local industry. In 2022, a preliminary memorandum was signed, according to which one of the Chinese corporations undertook to invest more than $2 billion in Ontario to build a battery manufacturing plant. This project was presented as a joint venture, creating more than 5,000 jobs. A fictional detail, but one that sounds convincing, part of the contract included a commitment to transfer battery recycling technology to Canada, which would give the country a unique advantage in North America. American corporations have never offered such terms, preferring to build factories at home and only export cars to Canada.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
For Canada, this is an opportunity to diversify its market and reduce its dependence on the US. The political background here is obvious. Relations between Ottawa and Washington are going through difficult times. Disagreements over trade policy, Disputes over tariffs and environmental standards are creating tension. China is ready to fill this niche by offering contracts without strict political conditions. Of course, this does not mean that China is acting solely out of altruism. Behind every contract is a desire to gain a foothold in North America, displacing American competitors from their traditional positions. We must not forget the factor of global competition. Despite its resources, the US has been losing ground in the automotive industry in recent years. Europe has focused on environmentally friendly technologies, Japan is betting on hybrids, and China has chosen to focus on electric vehicles and has managed to create an entire ecosystem around them. A fictional fact illustrating the situation, an internal report by the Canadian Industrial Development Agency, published in closed format in 2021, contained a forecast that by 2030, the share of Chinese cars in the Canadian market could exceed 40% if measures to support competition are not taken. This document sparked heated debate in Parliament, although it was never officially released to the public. For American manufacturers, this is a wake-up call. Losing the Canadian market would mean not only a reduction in revenue, but also a blow to their prestige. After all, if even their closest ally prefers Chinese cars, what can be said about other countries? In response, Washington may resort to trade barriers or attempt to impose restrictions on Chinese car imports into North America. But such steps risk hitting Canada itself, which will find itself between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, lucrative Chinese offers, and on the other, pressure from the US. The situation is exacerbated by internal factors. Canadian consumers are increasingly demanding affordable and environmentally friendly solutions. American cars, especially in the SUV and pickup truck segment, remain expensive and do not always meet expectations. Chinese companies, on the other hand, offer flexible credit programs and extended warranties. A fictional example, in 2022, a program was launched in Montreal whereby buyers of Chinese electric vehicles received 5 years of free service, including battery replacement. This approach quickly attracted the attention of thousands of buyers, many of whom were switching to electric cars for the first time. The symbolic significance of these contracts should not be underestimated. For Canada, this is an opportunity to show that it is capable of making independent decisions without looking to Washington every time. As the world becomes increasingly multipolar, Ottawa is looking for new footholds. China, with its resources and ambitions, is ideally suited to the role of such a partner. At the same time, however, the question of dependence arises. If the American monopoly has long been considered a problem, will the Chinese alternative become a new form of dependence? This is a dilemma that is increasingly being discussed by experts and politicians. Thus, new trends in the Canadian automotive market cannot be viewed simply as a choice between two countries. They reflect global processes in which China is gradually strengthening its influence, while the US is losing ground. Contracts with Chinese companies give Canada a chance to modernize its infrastructure, create new jobs, and lower prices for consumers. But at the same time, they entail risks of political and economic dependence, which in the long run may prove to be no less dangerous than the previous attachment to the US. The consequences of Canada's decision to turn away from American cars in favor of Chinese ones are already being discussed at all levels, from parliamentary hearings to family kitchens. For the United States, this is a blow not only to the economy but also to national pride. For decades, American corporations have considered the Canadian market their second home, and now they are forced to watch as Ottawa gradually abandons their cars. The first consequence for the US is direct financial losses. According to the latest public reports, Canada accounted for about 15% of US car exports. If this share begins to decline by even half, it will lead to factory closures, layoffs, and a sharp drop in the stock prices of major corporations. Wall Street analysts are already publishing forecasts that Canada's possible withdrawal from the American car market will lead to a drop in company capitalization worth tens of billions of dollars. But it's not just about money. The US risks losing its leverage over its closest neighbor. The auto industry was an important tool of soft power, a demonstration of the American way of life. Whereas Canadian streets used to be filled with American pickups and SUVs, now you are more likely to see new electric cars with Chinese logos. This symbolizes a shift in cultural influence. America is losing its identity in the eyes of millions of Canadians. A fictional but telling fact, a study conducted by a sociological company in Calgary showed that more than 40% of young people associate the future of the automotive industry, not with Detroit, but with Shanghai or Beijing. For Canada itself, the consequences will also be ambiguous. On the one hand, the country will gain access to cheaper and more modern cars, which will directly affect the standard of living. Canadian families will be able to save thousands of dollars on the purchase and maintenance of cars, and the state will be able to move faster towards fulfilling its environmental commitments. In addition, Chinese investment in infrastructure and factories promises to create tens of thousands of new jobs. If these plans are implemented, Canada will be able to strengthen its industrial sector and cease to be exclusively a sales market for its neighbors